Hello, a very good afternoon to one and all. So is my voice audible? If it is not audible, please type in the chat box. Okay. So we are discussing about neuro-ophthalmology. We have dealt about the visual field defects, the anatomy of the visual pathway, what are the various lesions of that visual pathway, what are the various visual field defects it produces, what are the various abnormal pupillary reflexes, and all these we have seen in the previous classes. Just one thing you remember, that homonymous and heteronymous, it is a little confusing term. So homonymous hemianopia or heteronymous hemianopia. Homo means same. So homonymous means suppose the right side of the visual field is affected in both the eyes. That is right side in the right eye and right side in the left eye. That is the temporal field of the right eye and the nasal field of the left eye. If both these are affected or the patient is unable to see this, it is known as homonymous. So homo means the same side of the visual field the patient doesn't see. That is either the right side or the left side, which is seen in case of lesions of optic tract and apo, that is lateral geniculate body, optic radiations and all. Whereas heteronymous hemianopia, heteronymous means it is different. It is different like means it will be either binasal, both the nasal fields is not able to see, or bitemporal, both the temporal aspects is not able to see. So homonymous hemianopia means same side of the field is gone, either right-sided or left-sided. Whereas in heteronymous, it is either binasal or bitemporal. So that is about homonymous and heteronymous hemianopia. And there is again one more term, congruous and incongruous. CONGROUS in your textbooks. So congruous means the scotoma, that is the part of the vision which we are not seeing. That is the non-seeing area of visual field is represented as a black dot on the visual field charting. In those junctional scotoma and all I have shown you. So the symmetry and size of that black part is symmetrical or they are same in both the eyes, then it is called congruous. If it is different, it is called incongruous. So congruous means the intensity, depth and symmetry and extent of the scotoma is same in both the eyes. If it is different in size, different in extent, different in symmetry and depth and all, then it is called as to be incongruous. So congruous are seen in case of cortical lesions, whereas incongruous are seen in case of optic tract, optic radiation, etc., other lesions, optic nerve, etc. Okay, so that was in brief about the previous classes. We also dealt with Marcus Gunn pupil, Hutchinson's pupil, Argyll Robertson pupil, and all. So now the concept part of this neuro-ophthalmology is almost done. Now everything is just like by-hearting type. So today onwards we'll be seeing the inflammatory disorders and the degenerative disorders of the optic nerve and visual pathway. Okay. So coming to optic neuritis, it is a very important thing, important disease. You can see it in your clinics daily, day in and day out. It can come. As well as this optic neuritis is very important for your exam point of view also. So anywhere the term itis, it is there, it means inflammation. So it is neuritis, inflammation of the nerves. So optic neuritis, so inflammation of the optic nerve. Okay. So what is this? It is an inflammatory as well as a demyelinating disease of the optic nerve. The optic nerve is surrounded by myelin sheath. So an inflammatory as well as the demyelinating disease of the optic nerve is known as optic neuritis. What are the etiology? Most of the cases it is idiopathic. So in medicine, you remember anywhere you write idiopathic as the cause of a disease, you'll be right in 90% of the cases. Because in most of the cases, idiopathic will be the reason behind it. We can't say what is the reason for that particular entity. So anywhere in your practical exams, if you fumble, if your professor asks you some question, what is the cause for this particular disease? If you say idiopathic, almost all of the times, most of the times you'll be correct if you say idiopathic. And the second most common thing is trauma. If you say what are the causes, if you say trauma, so that is also mostly correct in most of the cases, but not here in case of optic neuritis. Here idiopathic holds true, but not trauma. But in some cases, trauma will be also be holding good 80 to 90% of the cases. Okay. So what is the cause of this inflammation and demyelination of the optic nerve? Idiopathic, cause is unknown most of the cases. It could be hereditary, like in Leber's optic neuropathy. That condition will deal in detail later on slides. Demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis and Devick's disease. Devick's disease is also known as neuromyelitis optica. So multiple sclerosis is one of the demyelinating diseases of the CNS. You'll be reading about it in detail in your general medicine classes next year. Similarly, para-infectious conditions, that is after a bout of infection of measles virus or mumps, etc. Or post-vaccination, that is live attenuated virus vaccines if you give. After that also you can get optic neuritis. Similarly, post-infectious, like sinusitis. I told you the ethmoidal and sphenoid sinuses are very closely located to the orbit, separated by a thin piece of bone known as lamina papyracea. And any infections of these sinuses can spread easily into the orbit, especially the intraorbital part of optic nerve can get inflamed with it. So in sinusitis, similarly in syphilis, Lyme disease, these are the infectious causes. And toxic optic neuropathy. What are the various toxic optic neuropathies like methanol, amblyopia, and etc. We will be seeing in the subsequent slides. Okay. I hope my audio is clear. If my audio is not clearly audible, please type. Okay. So what is the anatomical classification of this optic neuritis? So in exam, if they ask you 4 marks, what is optic neuritis? First, you write it as a definition. It is an inflammatory and demyelinating disease of the optic nerve. And what is the anatomical classification? Based on the location, I told you the optic nerve is divided into 4 parts: intraocular part, intraorbital part, intracanalicular part, and intracranial part. Okay. So the first part is intraocular part. I told you about the glaucoma, what are the changes takes place in glaucoma, ISNT rule, and all those things I told you in your previous classes. I also told you that the intraocular part is also known as papilla. That is, any elevated structure in our human body is known as a papilla. So here, as it is an elevation of these nerve fibers, it is also called to be a papilla. So here, as per anatomical classification, if the intraocular part, that is only the optic disc, is inflamed or demyelinated, it is known as papillitis, and most commonly it is unilateral. Similarly, neuroretinitis. If the optic disc along with surrounding area of retina is inflamed, along with involvement of macula, a macular star is formed. That is known as neuroretinitis. This macular star, I'll show you in a diagram. So anatomical classification is papillitis. Only intraocular part, that is only the optic disc, is inflamed, it is called papillitis. Neuroretinitis, when the optic disc along with the surrounding retina as well as the macula are involved, it is known as neuroretinitis, which is seen in case of infectious conditions, worm infestations mainly. And retrobulbar neuritis. Here the optic nerve behind the eyeball is inflamed. Behind the eyeball means it could either be the intraorbital part or intracanalicular part or intracranial part. But most commonly the inflammation we see in case of intraorbital part. So anatomically, optic neuritis can be classified into papillitis, neuroretinitis, retrobulbar neuritis. Papillitis, only optic disc is involved. Neuroretinitis, optic disc plus surrounding retina and macula is involved. Retrobulbar neuritis, the part of optic nerve behind the eyeball is involved. That is usually the intraorbital part. The intracranial and intracanalicular part also can be inflamed. So what are the symptoms of this optic neuritis? There is a sudden loss of vision which is progressive. That is, unless like your vitreous hemorrhage, in vitreous hemorrhage what happens is suddenly there is a painless loss of vision. But here there is a loss of vision. It is sudden but progressive. That is not progressive for days, but just within 24 to 48 hours almost the vision is gone, progressive loss, and almost it can go up to 1 week. So there is a sudden loss of vision which is progressive in nature. Okay, or else just to remember sudden loss of vision. There is a delayed dark adaptation. That is, whenever the patient enters a dark area, he takes more time, or it becomes difficult for the patient to get acclimatized to the dark area. Similarly, color vision defects. The patient will complain of color vision defects in any case of optic nerve inflammation. And the most common color affected is the red color. So the red color desaturation. So you have different colors and the primary colors are red, green and blue. So what happens is here, red desaturation. So the red color is desaturated and the red color is the first color to be affected in case of optic neuritis or any inflammations or diseases of the optic nerve. So there is a color vision defect, there is red desaturation, delayed dark adaptation, and there is a sudden loss of vision. And there will be movement phosphenes. So what are these phosphenes? So in the absence of a visual stimulus, if the patient gets a visual impulse, it is called a phosphene. So what is a phosphene is some non-visual stimulus which produces a visual reaction, that is known as a phosphene. So here what happens is, suppose your finger is moving in front of your eye. Suppose there is an optic neuritis patient, and if you suddenly move your finger in front of the patient, this finger movement is not a visual stimulus, but still it brings about a visual stimulus in his eye. He feels as if some light is getting flashed on his retina. That is one thing. Similarly, there will be some auditory stimulus. The patient hears some sounds. So with that sounds, he sees some objects moving in front of the eye. So that is known as a phosphene. A phosphene is nothing but it is a complex neurological phenomena where non-visual stimulus evokes some movement responses, some visual responses, that is known as a phosphene. Suppose the patient hears a loud sound or there is some object moving in front of you in your visual field, the patient appreciates as a small dots are moving in front of his eye. So that is known as a movement phosphene. Next, UTAF symptoms. What is this UTAF symptoms is any optic neuritis patient, if he does an exercise or a workout or he goes to a gym, there is some visual obscuration. So any patient of optic neuritis, if he goes into a hot area, in a hot place, that is some outside into under the sun he goes or something, if he goes into a heated atmosphere, or if he does any exercise, that is physical exercise, then he gets some visual obscuration. His vision is blurred for some time. So that is known as UTAF symptoms. And what is the reason behind this is, the nerve impulses are conducted only when the sodium channels open. When the sodium channels open, the nerve impulse is generated and there is conduction of nerve impulse. But when there is a rise in temperature of body because of exercise or going into a warm atmosphere or a warm temperature place, so this increase in temperature causes closure of the sodium channel, which leads to delay in conduction of nerve impulses. So the vision will be obscured for a patient for quite some time of time, for quite a while of time while he is doing an exercise. So UTAF symptoms is visual obscurations while exercise or going into a heated place. Next is Pulfric's phenomena. So what is this Pulfric's phenomena is decreased depth perception for moving objects. So suppose I told you in my squint classes the depth perception, the three-dimensional thing and all. So if you see an object like this, you can see the depth, how far it is from you and all these things. You can know by the depth perception or three-dimensional stereopsis. Stereopsis is the exact term for it. So in Pulfric's phenomena, what happens is that stereopsis for moving objects comes down. If an object is stationary, you can say that it is deep or superficial. But if that same object, three-dimensional object is moving, you can't exactly identify the depth and dimensions of that particular object. That is known as Pulfric's phenomena. And then pain in retrobulbar neuritis. In the initial classes, I told you, superior rectus and medial rectus muscles, a few fibers of these muscles are attached to the meningeal sheaths of the optic nerve. So the optic nerve's meningeal sheaths are attached, have a few attachments of the fibers from the superior and medial rectus muscles. So there is a pain in retrobulbar neuritis in movement of the eye. So whenever the patient tries to move his eye up or towards the nasal side, there is contraction of the superior and medial rectus muscles. And as few muscle fibers of the superior and medial rectus are inserted into the meninges of the optic nerve, and as the meninges are inflamed, that inflammation also spreads to these muscle fibers, thereby causing pain in the muscle fibers when they move here and there. Okay, so there is a pain in retrobulbar neuritis on movement of the eyes, especially in the superior and the medial movement of the eyes. So that is one thing. Okay, and what are the signs? So symptom is what the patient complains, and signs are what the doctors elicit. This basic thing you have to remember. Okay, so signs are visual acuity is reduced. Suppose the patient has got a wonderful vision of 6/6, it falls down to around counting fingers or hand movements within 1 week or sometimes even in days. Okay, and the color vision is defective. I told you initially it starts for the red color. Red color is the most affected. The red color looks very pale, so red desaturation is seen. Similarly, pupil, Marcus Gunn pupil or RAPD, relative afferent pupillary defect. So there is direct reflex is abnormal, but the indirect or consensual reflex is normal. We have discussed about this in detail in the previous class. And visual field defects. There is a centrocecal scotoma. That is the central part of the vision is gone. And there is a reduced contrast sensitivity. Contrast sensitivity is nothing but ability to differentiate between two colors. So here you see this is white color and the surrounding thing is black color. So you are able to differentiate between this white and black. See, these letters are written in black and the surrounding background is white. So because there is a strong contrast between white and black, you are able to recognize the letters against a white background. Suppose if I type everything in white in color, if I type these letters in white in color, you can't know whether the letters are there or not. So that is a poor contrast. So contrast is a drastic difference between the intensities or saturations of two colors. Thereby, we can able to clearly identify that particular object or particular color. As here you can see, this is black in color, this is white in color. That has got a good contrast. But if I type all these letters in white color, you will not be able to identify those letters. So that is a poor contrast sensitivity, whereas black and white have got a good contrast sensitivity. So this kind of a differentiation is also lost in case of optic neuritis. So what are the ophthalmoscopy features? So ophthalmoscopy is nothing but in your practical classes actually will be telling you there is direct and indirect ophthalmoscopy. So just to remember that with the ophthalmoscopy you might have seen doctors will be examining, coming close to the patient. So examination of the interior of the eyeball is known as ophthalmoscopy. Examination of the interior of the eyeball, that is vitreous and retina and all the parts, that is known as ophthalmoscopy. So what are the differentiating features of papillitis, neuroretinitis and retrobulbar neuritis on ophthalmoscopy? In papillitis, the disc is hyperemic, that is red in color. It has margins are blurred. The disc is edematous. There is obliteration of physiological cup. There are flame-shaped hemorrhages and exudates over the disc. The retinal veins are congested and tortuous. and inflammatory cells like polymorphonuclear neutrophils, that is your neutrophils, can be present in the vitreous cells. Neuroretinitis, similar findings, except that a macular star is also present, inflammation of surrounding retina. In retrobulbar neuritis, the fundus is normal. Here, there is a famous saying that neither the patient nor ophthalmologist sees anything. Here, the patient is blind or the patient's vision is gone because of retrobulbar neuritis, so the patient is not able to see anything. Similarly, the ophthalmologist tries to look out for an abnormality, but all his fundus looks normal. So ophthalmologist also doesn't see any abnormality. So in a sarcastic way, it has been put like neither the patient nor the ophthalmologist sees anything. That is, the patient doesn't see anything, any vision. His vision is totally gone. He's blind or he doesn't see anything. Whereas the ophthalmologist is unable to find out any abnormality in his fundus. Okay. So the same thing in a diagrammatic way. So this is papillitis. You see the disc is edematous. So the margins of the optic disc are blurred here. Here you see the disc margins are very clear. Here the margins are blurred. There are flame-shaped hemorrhages all around the margins of the optic disc. The vessels are engorged and tortuous. Here you see the vessels are plain. Here the arteries are normal, but here you see the arteries are engorged and tortuous and dilated. Okay, and the disc is elevated. Here you can see the vessels are taking a bend here. But here the vessels are almost straight. Here a small bend is there, but comparatively here you see the vessels are bending sharply. That means there is an elevation of the optic disc. So elevation of the disc, blurring of the margins. Here you can see the physiological cup. The white part is clearly seen, but here it is obliterated. So obliteration of the physiological cup, blurring of the margins, red color discoloration of the disc, hyperemic disc. Here you see the disc is pale pink in color, which is normal color, pale pink. Here it is red in color. The vessels are engorged and tortuous. Flame-shaped hemorrhages are present. All these findings are absent here. So this is a case of optic neuritis in the right eye. Similarly, neuroretinitis, the findings will be same. See, the physiological cup is small, optic disc margins are blurred. Along with that, there is inflammation of surrounding retina. And the most specific finding is macular star. Here you see, macular star is nothing but hard exudates. Hard exudates are nothing but lipoprotein and lipid-laden macrophages are deposited. So hard exudates in your retina classes you might have learned, they are nothing but, suppose if this blood vessel breaks, there is a break in the capillary membrane of this particular blood vessel, the lipid leaks out from the blood vessel. Similarly, plasma also leaks out. Along with that, lipid-filled macrophages also leak out. So they form some deposits here in the retina, which are known as hard exudates. So this hard exudate collections around the retina in form of a star. You see they are arranged like a starfish shape. Like a star, that is known as a macular star. So macular star with optic disc findings of optic neuritis, it is termed as neuroretinitis. Okay. So here you can see the star-shaped pattern very clearly. Here is see, first of all, the optic disc is inflamed, margins are disc, physiological cup is obliterated, the vessels are engorged and tortuous, the vessels are bending here, margins are blurred, all these things. Along with that, there is a star-shaped radiation of this hard exudates, lipid and lipid-filled macrophages around this macula. So this is a neuroretinitis, typical case. And this is retrobulbar neuritis. I told you the ophthalmologist doesn't see any abnormality. The ophthalmologist doesn't see any abnormality. The entire fundus looks normal. So here with the help of neuroimaging like MRI of orbit or by doing a B scan, we are by excluding all other diseases, finally retrobulbar neuritis is a diagnosis of exclusion. Suppose the patient complains of pain in ocular movements, especially on elevation and medial on medial rotation, and when there is sudden loss of vision, which is painful ocular movements, the patient doesn't see anything, and there is a centrocecal scotoma. And in case of pupil, there is an RAPD, relative afferent pupillary defect, and the fundus is normal. Then we can come to a diagnosis of retrobulbar neuritis. We can confirm it with an MRI scan. Okay. So what are the differential diagnoses of this papillitis? It could be papilledema. It could be anterior ischemic ophthalmic neuropathy. It could be compressive optic neuropathy due to some trauma, or it could be pseudopapilledema. So all these things we'll deal in the next slides. Similarly, acute retrobulbar neuritis, it could be due to malingering or due to cortical blindness. Cortical blindness means I told you in the occipital cortex, suppose there is some infarct. I told you in case of CVA patient, suppose middle cerebral artery block or some anterior or inferior cerebral artery block is there. So the entire occipital cortex is gone. In that case also the fundus will be normal. Because I told you optic atrophy takes place only up to the lateral geniculate body, because the second order neurons synapse with the third order neurons in the lateral geniculate body. So any lesion in the occipital cortex, there is cortical blindness. That is, the impulses go up to the lateral geniculate body and optic radiations, but in visual cortex, they are not processed because of a hemorrhage or infarct in the occipital cortex or due to some tumor or trauma or whatever disease it may be. So in cortical blindness, there is no descending optic atrophy. So the fundus also looks normal. In malingering also, the fundus looks normal. So now here an important difference, what is malingering and what is hysteria. So neuro-ophthalmology, it is a club of all the topics, even some psychiatry part also you have to learn. So what is malingering? It is most common in males. So here what is the thing is, suppose the patient has got some secondary gain. Suppose there is a child, he has got an exam, he didn't study well for the exam. He doesn't want to go for the exam or he doesn't want to go to school. So what he says, the common complaint, he says, I am having stomach pain. So stomach pain, like school children, that is the most common instance of malingering we face in our day in and day out life. The parents get agitated and they bring him to a pediatrician. The pediatrician finally examines everything and says that the baby is fine, he was just malingering. So the school children, especially males who don't want to go to school or don't want to go to an exam, so they malinger. They fake some illness. That is, they say that they have got some stomach pain or they have got a headache or something, some symptoms they say. So that is known as a malingering. So the malingerer has got some gain. Like he has a gain, either he wants to apply for a handicap certificate, or he wants to leave some study leave he wants, or some education sick leave he wants, or he doesn't want to go to a military duty. In that case, who feigns some, who imitates some thing like this, some symptom, that is known as a malingering. So has got some financial gain, like some handicap certificate or some insurance or something like that, or he doesn't want to go for an exam. So these are the things what the person achieves by malingering, which is common in males. So similarly, there is a condition called hysteria. So hysteria, it is most common in females, so especially adolescent girls. So in this hysteria, what happens is everything is like this malingering only. The patient is absolutely normal, but the patient says that he has got a stomach pain, or he is unable to see, or his vision of one eye is gone. Some complaint in the hysteria also, the patient says some complaint, but in hysteria, there is no secondary gain for that. See, in malingering, the patient either doesn't want to go to school, or he doesn't want to write his exam, or he has to claim some insurance policy money, or he doesn't want to go for some job, especially like military job, or there is some financial gain behind this malingering. But in hysteria, everything is same. The patient says that he has got a symptom, but there is no secondary gain in that. So here the patients are just attention seeking. So for hysteria patients, you go near them, you pacify them, you ask them what is your disease. Okay, I'm going to take you to a hospital, and the doctor is going to give you some medicine. If you say like that, the hysteric patients will calm down, and they will also like to come to a hospital, because they only want attention and they desire a treatment. So if the hysteria patient is taken to a hospital, he will happily say that his symptoms are gone, because he is only attention seeking, and there is no financial gain or no secondary gain behind that hysteric patients, which is most common in females, especially adolescents. Whereas in a malingerer, it is not like that. He initially refuses to go to a hospital, because he knows if he goes to a hospital, the doctor will say that he's completely normal, he has to go for his exam. So malingerer usually refuses to go for an examination, whereas a hysteric patient always obliges to go for an examination. So malingerer has got some secondary gain, whereas a hysteric patient doesn't have any gain. Malingerer is more common in males and hysteria is more common in females. So if the fundus is entirely normal, so the fundus has got no pathology and the patient is saying, I'm unable to see. So you don't know whether it is a malingering, whether it is a hysteria, whether it is an acute retrobulbar neuritis. So if you ask him the symptoms and if everything resolves, it is a hysteria. If still it is not resolving, it could be malingerer, it could be acute retrobulbar neuritis. If it is retrobulbar neuritis, ask about the symptoms, pain on ocular movement, sudden loss of vision, and all these things are a different test to rule out malingering or neuroimaging. That is a big class. It is only for postgraduate sake. It is not required for you. Malingering, how to diagnose it, especially visual malingering. Okay. So similarly, prognosis. So in optic neuritis, what happens is the maximum vision loss occurs by 1 week. So by 1 week, but suppose today the symptoms started by Monday, almost by next Monday, the maximum vision loss has occurred. So beyond that Monday, that is beyond 7 days, the vision loss no more goes. Suppose initially the patient has a vision of 6/6 and it has come down to 6/36. Up to 1 week, it can still fall up to 6/18 or 6/24 counting fingers. But after 1 week, there are less chances that the symptoms will reduce. And if still the vision is reducing even beyond 1 week, then you should think of other diagnoses like Leber's optic neuropathy, etc. It could not be optic neuritis. Okay, and the visual recovery starts within 2 weeks. And normally the vision returns in 75 to 90% of cases by 4 to 6 weeks. Almost by 4 to 6 weeks, in 90% of the cases, the vision returns to normal. And in some cases, it remaining 25 to 10 to 20% of cases, it may take more than 6 weeks. So the prognosis, what you have to remember is up to 7 days, the maximum vision loss can occur. After 7 days, the vision loss usually reduces or usually doesn't occur. It remains there and recovery starts within 2 weeks. And by 4 to 6 weeks, almost the vision is normal with and without treatment. But what is the use of treatment is the treatment will hasten the recovery. Usually it takes 4 to 6 weeks for the vision to recover. But if you start some treatment with steroids, immediately the vision may recover within 1 or 2 weeks. So why it is indicated, we will see. So usually the treatment, optic, there is a trial known as optic nerve treatment trial. Usually in your pharmacology, you'll be having so many drug trials. That is, they recruit some people with some drug and other people with other type of drug, and they'll see in whom the response is better, which drug is better. So these kind of clinical studies are known as trials. Okay. So similarly, there was a optic ONTT trial, optic neuritis, not optic nerve. Sorry for this. It is optic neuritis treatment trial, ONTT. Optic neuritis treatment trial. It was a large multicenter trial which is conducted. So in that, what they found out that in optic neuritis patient, if you give IV, that is here IV means intravenous. So if intravenous methylprednisolone is given, it speeds up the visual recovery. So what I told you, usually the visual recovery takes 4 to 6 weeks. But if you give intravenous methylprednisolone, the vision recovery is still faster. That is, even within less than 4 weeks also the visual recovery will occur. But the ultimate recovery is not affected. Ultimate recovery means here you see, here usually the normal vision returns, but sometimes the patient may not get his 6/6 vision back. Sometimes he may remain at 6/9 or 6/12. So though in optic neuritis, after optic neuritis, the patient regains his vision, it may not be the normal vision which he had before the disease. Suppose before the disease, patient has got some 6/6 vision. So after the resolution of optic nerve, his vision may somewhere stagnate around 6/9 or 6/12. So complete vision recovery is not guaranteed after optic neuritis. So even if you give treatment also, complete vision recovery, that is the patient achieving 6/6 is not possible in all the cases, but still the speed of the visual recovery is more. Usually it takes 4 to 6 weeks, but here if you give treatment, even within 2 to 3 weeks also, the patient can recover, his vision can recover. And only oral steroids are contraindicated. So usually intravenous intravenous injections of methylprednisolone is advised, and only oral steroids of, that is oral methylprednisolone, is contraindicated, because only oral steroids, if you give, the recurrences of optic neuritis is more common, and there is also the possibility of recurrence of multiple sclerosis if you give only oral steroids. That's why this treatment particular trial suggested that IV methylprednisolone, that is intravenous injection of methylprednisolone, speeds up the visual recovery. And one more advantage what they found out is that if you give injection methylprednisolone, that is intravenous methylprednisolone, the chances of recurrences of optic neuritis are reduced. The chances of recurrences are reduced, and the chances of going into multiple sclerosis, a CNS demyelinating disorder of the CNS, are reduced, and also the vision recovery is fast. And that's why IV methylprednisolone is indicated in cases of optic neuritis. Only oral steroids are contraindicated, because only oral steroids, if you give, what will happen is the chances of recurrences are more, and the vision may not recover properly, and the chances of going into multiple sclerosis are also more. Okay, so optic nerve treatment trial. If there is a positive, so in any optic neuritis treatment, we always go for intravenous methylprednisolone, followed by anytime steroid. If you use for more than 48 hours, you should always taper. Always remember this logic. Unless until in exceptional cases, always in a routine, if you start steroids for any patient for any condition, whether it could be general surgery or dermatology or ENT or ophthalmology, if you start steroids, immediately you should not stop the steroids. You should gradually suppress. Because steroids, when you give, what happens is it suppresses the ACTH hormone in your pituitary. So when there is high levels of methylprednisolone or dexamethasone in your blood after taking a tablet or an injection, its a molecule is similar in structure to your cortisol hormone. So cortisol hormone or methylprednisolone, if they are higher in your blood, they will automatically, by second negative feedback mechanism, they inhibit the release of ACTH from your hypothalamus or pituitary gland. So when ACTH release is suppressed, so all of a sudden, when you suddenly stop this methylprednisolone, what will happen is, all of a sudden you don't have any methylprednisolone you don't have any cortisol in your blood, because all the cortisol and all the methylprednisolone has been used by your body. Also, and ACTH secretion is also not there for the past 1 week when you are giving this oral steroids or IV steroids. So suddenly when you stop the steroids, it takes for some time for the ACTH to get secreted. And once the ACTH gets secreted, it takes some time for the cortisol to secrete it. So all of a sudden, if you stop the steroid, there is a lack of ACTH. So when there is a deficiency of ACTH, the cortisol is not secreted immediately. So the patient immediately lands into hypocortisolemia or Addison's crisis. So Addison's disease, you all know. So similarly, it is a crisis which the patient lands in. So after, if you use any steroid for more than 48 hours, always make it a point never to stop it all of a sudden. Remember this for your lifetime in all your departments. Okay. So for any positive MRI brain for multiple sclerosis or any optic neuritis, we start him on pulse therapy of IV methylprednisolone. What is this pulse therapy is? 1 gram of methylprednisolone we give. mixed in 500 ml of normal saline. So 1 gram of methylprednisolone in 500 ml of normal saline over 2 hours. Like that for 3 successive days. That is today, tomorrow, and day after tomorrow we will give. That is known as pulse therapy. So pulse therapy of IV methylprednisolone, 1 gram of methylprednisolone is given intravenously for 3 days continuously, mixed in 500 ml of NS. That is pulse therapy. After this one, I told you, for more than 48 hours, if you use steroid, you should taper it gradually. You should not stop it suddenly. So you will start him on oral prednisolone or methylprednisolone at the rate of 1 mg per kg body weight per day from day 3. That is, for 3 days, you will put him on injections. From day 4, you will start him on oral steroids. It will continue up to 11 days. After that, you will taper the steroids gradually over the next 4 days. This is the treatment for optic neuritis and also for multiple sclerosis. Okay. So normal MRI brain, IVMP indicated. So usually, if the brain has positive symptoms for multiple sclerosis only, we start this pulse therapy of methylprednisolone. Some people say that it is usually depends on this. It varies from surgeon to surgeon and book to book. So some surgeons prefer to start IV methylprednisolone for any case of optic neuritis, but some surgeons they prefer to put it only if the MRI brain is positive for multiple sclerosis only. They will put him on methylprednisolone steroids. But to be on the safer side, in practical point of view, always better to start on steroids because later on the patient may sue you in court of life. Something happens because you are not given treatment, my vision went down. So like that, to avoid legal complications, better to start. Though in books they mention that IV methylprednisolone is indicated only in few conditions. And similarly, if the MRI brain is normal, there are no evidences of multiple sclerosis because most of the cases, optic neuritis cases are associated with multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis can be detected by MRI brain. So if the brain MRI is normal, there is no evidence of multiple sclerosis, still it is better to start IV methylprednisolone. First thing, to avoid legal hassles with the patient. And the second thing is, if both the eyes are affected. Suppose both the eyes are affected, patient will be blind. That's why at least to give him some useful vision, you should start IV methylprednisolone. If he's a one-eyed patient, one eye is already blind, other eye is also gone due to optic neuritis, so better you give so that his visual recovery is hastened. And similarly, if the vision loss is progressing even beyond 1 week, I told you in optic neuritis, usually up to 1 week, the vision loss is there. After 1 week, there should be no more vision loss. If the vision loss is progressing beyond 1 week, then again you have to start him on IV methylprednisolone. These are the indications. But in practical purposes, usually during my PG days and all, I have almost seen every patient has been started on IV methylprednisolone. Okay. So that was about optic neuritis. So next, other small topics. What is Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy? It is a condition. It is a type of optic neuropathy seen in males, usually at the age of 20 years. Usually at the age of 20 years, males 20 years of age. It is usually a mitochondrial disease. Females are carriers. Initially, the fundus is normal, just like your retrobulbar neuritis. I told you, Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy is one more differential diagnosis of retrobulbar neuritis besides malingering and hysteria. And later on, initially the fundus is normal, but after 1 week or so, you can get the disc will become hyperemic, followed by optic atrophy, and the patient will be blind forever. I have seen such kind of cases. 3 cases I have seen in my PG days. So initially the patient will be normal. After 1 week, the patient will be having a hyperemic disc and optic atrophy, and finally the patient will be blind for his lifetime. There is no treatment for it as of now. Okay. And then toxic or nutritional optic neuropathy. So it is damage to the optic nerve due to exogenous or endogenous toxin. So tobacco smoking. So tobacco cures or tobacco smoking, what happens is cyanide is released. So this cyanide is a neurotoxin which damages the optic nerve or the axons, and the patient may go blind. Similarly, ethyl alcohol. So a patient, a chronic alcoholic. So chronic alcoholic, when he consumes so much of ethyl alcohol, what happens is he lands up in B12 deficiency. Vitamin B12 deficiency is absorption is decreased due to gastritis. Because excessive of ethyl alcohol intake leads to gastritis. Because of gastritis, B12 deficiency is there. So vitamin B12 intake, when it is reduced, it causes optic neuropathy, which is a type of nutritional optic neuropathy. And in general medicine, you will come across a condition called subacute combined degeneration of the cord, SCDC. Subacute combined degeneration of the cord. That is also a manifestation of vitamin B12 deficiency where the spinal cord gets degenerated. And similarly, quinine, which is an anti-malarial drug, it will cause blindness, deafness, and tinnitus. So these are the various causes of toxic or nutritional optic neuropathy. Okay. So B12 deficiency loss, the neuron myelin sheath is not formed, and the nerve goes into damage. Okay, atrophy. Similarly, methyl alcohol amblyopia. In so many cases, in your news you might have seen, after drinking contaminated alcohol or adulterated alcohol, the patients went blind. Kalti Sara. In Telugu, if you want to say, they say Kalti Sara. So especially in villages for cheap liquor. So ethanol is very costly. So some manufacturers, what they do, they mix some amount of methyl alcohol in order to give the taste to the patients. So that methanol is very poisonous to the body and it can lead to death as well as permanent blindness. So in many times you might have seen in your TV channels, patient went blind after consuming adulterated alcohol or poor quality alcohol. So that is this methyl alcohol amblyopia. So here there is a sudden loss of vision and the blindness is permanent. We cannot reinstate the vision. That's why we have to be very careful, and the government has done so many awareness campaigns for this. And adulterated alcohols or even in fumes. Suppose people who are working in pharma factories, in manufacturing of various drugs, fumes of alcohol may be used. Alcohol may be used as preservative, like in your cough syrups, etc. So inhalation of the fumes, or in factory workers, prolonged exposure to ethanol, the absorption to the skin can take place when the ethanol is deposited on the skin. So these are the various things with methanol amblyopia. So what happens here actually is, so this is an alcohol. So methyl alcohol, when it is consumed, the alcohol is converted into acid. Okay, methanoic acid with the help of the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase. So any alcohol is metabolized in the body. If you go to your basic biochemistry, any alcohol if you take, it is metabolized by an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase into respective acid. Here methanoic acid. And this acid is further hydrolyzed into its aldehyde form by an enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase. So basically there are two enzymes. So disulfiram or antabuse. So disulfiram like reaction, you might have read in your biochemistry first year. What is disulfiram? For alcohol de-addiction, they use a drug called disulfiram. So what is this disulfiram? It inhibits the enzyme, this aldehyde dehydrogenase. So what happens is more amount of formaldehyde is accumulated here. So usually when you take alcohol, alcohol is converted by alcohol dehydrogenase into acid, and this acid is further converted into aldehyde by aldehyde dehydrogenase, which forms an aldehyde, formaldehyde. This formaldehyde is very toxic to the body. It causes irritation, flushing of skin, blindness, and acidosis, as well as even death also. That is the thing of formaldehyde. So this one, what it does is, your disulfiram or antabuse, it inhibits the enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase. So alcohol is converted to acid by alcohol dehydrogenase. Acid is converted to aldehyde by acid dehydrogenase. This aldehyde is further metabolized by the enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase. So this aldehyde dehydrogenase is inhibited by this your disulfiram or antabuse. So more amount of formaldehyde accumulates. So formaldehyde causes some bad symptoms which are not so liked by the patient, like redness of the skin, flushing, irritation, itching, and all. So the patient gradually develops an aversion to alcohol. So that's why it has been used in de-addiction. So this methanol, if you consumed in a higher quantity, it forms a lot of aldehyde, formaldehyde. That formaldehyde finally leads to death and blindness. So clinical feature: headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, pain, abdomen, and death. And order of breath and sweat also changes. It gives like the acidic aldehyde order is there. Okay, complete blindness. And the fundus was mild disc edema, narrowing of blood vessels, bilateral primary optic atrophy. Optic atrophy is a separate class. We'll see about that in our next class. So what is the treatment for this alcohol consumption? Suppose a patient, you are in a casualty, the patient comes to you with a complaint. The attendants bring to you, say that he has drunk some kaltisara or some adulterated alcohol. What you are going to do a good gastric lavage, remove as much of alcohol as possible, give intravenous sodium bicarbonate alkali injections to neutralize the acid, that is formic acid. So formic acid is responsible for this. So 500 ml of 5% solution, and ethyl alcohol you have to give. Ethyl alcohol competes with alcohol dehydrogenase, so no formaldehyde is formed. And finally, if this alcohol treatment also fails, go for dialysis. By dialysis, you remove all the formic acid content from the blood. Prognosis is very poor. It can lead to death or blindness. So here a small correction here. So alcohol is converted by alcohol dehydrogenase into acid. Acid is converted by aldehyde dehydrogenase into aldehyde. I told the reverse here. So acid, this formic acid is very noxious. So this aldehyde dehydrogenase is inhibited by disulfiram. So acid accumulates in the body. When the acid is accumulated, so formic acid accumulates. That formic acid will cause you all these kinds of symptoms. Okay, that is about that. So what is ethambutol amblyopia? In your pharmacology, you might have learned. In your TB chest classes also, you will learn. Ethambutol is a drug given for tuberculosis treatment. HRZD regimen. H for isoniazid, R for rifampicin, Z for pyrazinamide, and E for ethambutol. So ethambutol, E, usually the dosage is 15. This is a mnemonic. 5, 10, 20, 15 milligram per kg per day. So what is the dosage of antitubercular regimen? In exam, if you don't remember anything, you write H isoniazid 5 milligram per kg per day, rifampicin 10, Z is 20 milligram, and E ethambutol is 15 milligram per kg per day. So dosage is like this. In fundus, papillitis features, that is edema, obliteration of physiological cup, edematous blurring of the margins will be there. And here blue-yellow color vision defects are present initially. Central visual fields are affected, and some cases of bitemporal hemianopia. Bitemporal means both the temporal half is gone. That means heteronymous type of hemianopia can be done. Treatment is stop the drug, and it is usually said that along with ethambutol, isoniazid is also implicated in this pathogenesis. So stop, if possible, both the drugs together and go for an alternative drug. That's why before starting any anti-tuberculosis therapy, they send the patient to ophthalmologist to have a baseline fundus screening. So here you have to always do a visual field, and also you have to do the color vision charting for that particular patient. Similarly, next condition, anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. So what is this anterior ischemic optic neuropathy? It can be asked like a 2-mark question. So it is an ischemic damage to the optic nerve due to occlusion of short posterior ciliary arteries. So the optic nerve has got a blood supply. I told you the axial system, through the ophthalmic artery some branches come, and also the pial plexus surrounding the optic nerve also supplied. So the short posterior ciliary arteries are branches of this ophthalmic artery which supplies this optic nerve. So if these arteries are obliterated, or there is an ischemia in arteries, either due to inflammation of the blood vessel, that is arteritis, like your vaginous granulomatosis, polyarteritis nodosa, giant cell arteritis. So arteritis means inflammation of the blood wall of the artery. So arteritis, inflammation of the blood vessel wall itself, can cause occlusion of these arteries and ischemia, or non-arteritic. Even without inflammation of the blood vessel wall, suppose there is a cholesterol embolus or a cholesterol plaque, or due to trauma, there is a cutting of the optic nerve or the blood vessel supply, there is an ischemia to the optic neuropathy. It is called anterior because only the anterior part, that is optic nerve head or the intraocular part of the optic nerve, is affected. So this is anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. So arteritic is inflammation and thrombosis of the short posterior ciliary arteries. I told you there is inflammation of the arteries. And usually giant cell arteritis is a very common condition, more common in Western people, Western countries, usually seen in old age, more than 70 years. 5 to 10% of cases of giant cell arteritis contribute to this AION. And clinical features are systemic, like headache and temporal artery tenderness. So temporal artery is located somewhere here over the temple. It will be very tender. And even in your OP, if you see any patient with this temporal artery which is very prominent, suppose a curved and tortuous temporal artery with its pulsations, if you are seeing on the forehead, always send such kind of a patient for blood test, or send him to a neurologist or an ophthalmologist, because you could be saving the vision of a particular patient. So anywhere in your grandparents or outside or anywhere, if you see any patient, an old age patient with a prominent temporal artery here with this pulsating, so always rule out giant cell arteritis, because it is a very pathetic condition. The patient presents with headache and temporal artery tenderness will be there here, and jaw claudication, masseter ischemia, because this external carotid artery supplies all these jaw as well as the ophthalmic artery. Ophthalmic artery is itself a branch of the external carotid artery. So even its inflammation also can spread to that part, and it can cause to masseter ischemia. So the branches of external carotid artery, that is again an important PG question for you. Ascending pharyngeal, superior thyroid, lingual, facial, occipital, posterior auricular, superficial temporal, and maxillary. So these are the various branches of the external carotid artery in your first year anatomy if you revise. So the inflammation can also spread to this maxillary branches along with ophthalmic. So in that kind of cases, you can get jaw claudication. And similarly, the patient might have weight loss, night sweats, and muscle and joint pains. So these are the symptoms. So what are the ocular features? TIA, transient ischemic attack. So sudden blackouts, amaurosis fugax, that is sudden blackouts of vision. CRAO, arteritic, I told you, inflammation of the artery. So central retinal artery can get occluded, central retinal artery occlusion. Diplopia because the central retinal artery branches itself supply to the extraocular muscles. I told you medial muscular artery, lateral muscular artery, 2 long posterior ciliary arteries and all in my squint classes. I'm not going to go into details of that. So ischemia of these arteries can cause ischemia of muscles, thereby lead to diplopia. Sudden visual loss because of CRAO or optic atrophy itself, or optic neuritis. RAPD, optic disc edema. And here the specific condition is it is a pallid disc edema. Pallid means the disc is pale, because I told you the color of the optic disc is usually because of the blood supply. So here what happens in ischemia, there is no blood supply. So because the blood supply to the optic nerve is interfered with, as there is ischemia, the disc becomes pale. Normal color of the optic disc is pale pink because of the blood supply. But because of ischemia, it becomes pale. And along with that pale, if there is some disc edema, you should think of optic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. And there will be sectoral pallor. Usually the optic disc has got a sectoral blood supply. Suppose these are the 4 quadrants of the optic nerve. This part is supplied by one branch of short posterior ciliary artery. This is one branch, this is one branch, this is one branch. because there are 15 to 20 branches of short posterior ciliary arteries. So which branch is affected, based on that, the segment of optic disc which it supplies, that one will get pale disc edema. Similarly, cotton wool spots and flame-shaped hemorrhages and tender pulseless temporal arteries will be present. Investigations: fundus fluorescent angiography. It is just like any other cardiac angiography and all, your MRI angiogram, CT angiogram of abdomen, thorax, etc. Similarly, it is an angiogram of the retina. It shows delayed filling in the choroidal blood vessels. Visual field show an inferior altitudinal defect. This is an important PG bit. So inferior visual field defect is more. ESR and CRP is elevated. So ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate, and CRP, C-reactive protein, both are elevated in case of inflammations. So the normal ESR is age divided by 2 for males and age plus 10 by 2 for females. Suppose a 50 years male up to 25, 50 by 2, that is 25 up to ESR for first hour is normal for males. Similarly, suppose a 50-year female, 50 plus 10, 60. 60 by 2 is 30. Almost 30 millimeters for first hour is normal for females. So anything beyond that is elevated. And temporal artery biopsy is the gold standard and it confirms the diagnosis. Okay. So what is the treatment? It is an irreversible vision loss. Just you can prevent the other eye. If you IV methylprednisolone can be given followed by oral steroids, this one can reduce the inflammation. Suppose if it is a giant cell arteritis and the inflammation is present in one eye or one side of the ophthalmic artery, by giving steroids, you can suppress the inflammation, thereby preventing same vision loss occurring in the other eye. But besides this, there is no other treatment as of now. Similarly, non-arteritic AF1. Without inflammation, if there is a ischemia due to some occlusion of the arteries because of some cholesterol plague or due to some trauma or something, that is non-arteritic type. Cause is unknown here, could be any cause. Usually idiopathic is most common. And then risk factors for this one are small optic disc because more chance of vessel occlusion. Post-cataract surgery, there may be a hypotonia which can cause a sudden block. Similarly, smoking and thromboembolic disorders. I told you a cholesterol plaque can get lodged. And similarly, drugs like Viagra. Viagra is the trade name and the chemical name for it is sildenafil. So these are a group of hypotensive drugs. Usually they are phosphodiesterase 5 enzyme inhibitors. Phosphodiesterase 5 is an enzyme which causes vasoconstriction. So this Viagra is the trade name for the phosphodiesterase 5 enzyme inhibitor drug known as sildenafil. The other drugs in this group are sildenafil, tardarafil, valdarafil and all. So initially these drugs were identified or discovered in order to treat hypertension. That is, as these drugs inhibit the phosphodiesterase 5 enzyme, they cause vasodilatation, thereby leading to drop in the blood pressure. So they were initially used as a treatment for hypertension. Even today in pediatric ICUs, if you go for a pediatric ICU in your pediatric postings, any baby with pulmonary artery hypertension. So if there is any newborn with pulmonary artery hypertension, they prescribe this sildenafil tablets for them. Sildenafil tablet, they break into pieces, mix in milk, and they 1/4 tablet or like that, they give in milk to that particular baby. So that is one thing. So usually seen. So sildenafil is an antihypertensive drug. Okay, that is one more thing. So NAI1, non-arteritic anti-ischemic optic neuropathy. Clinical features, it is seen in young age, so 60 years. No ocular features, TIA, MROs, etc. are absent. The vision loss is less severe compared to arteritic type. The hyperemic disc edema is seen. In AF1, I told you pallor, but here, to the contrary, there is a hyperemic disc is present. ESR is not that much elevated as compared to AF1. In AF1, usually if the ESR is more than 60, it is definitely a positive diagnosis of AF1. But here ESR is not that much elevated. It may be around some 30 or 40, but not more than 60. Whereas in arteritic type or giant cell arteritis especially, the ESR will be around 60 to 70 millimeters for first hour. And in fundus fluorescent angiography, there is only a delay in the filling of blood vessels of optic disc. Whereas in AF1, it is filling of choroidal vasculature is also delayed. Okay. And differential diagnosis for NAION, optic neuritis, compressive optic neuropathy due to any trauma, diabetic papillopathy, and treatment are systemic risk factors, that is smoking, that hypertension, all is to be controlled. Aspirin can be prescribed. For these patients, we give aspirin or clopidogrel, antiplatelet drugs, so that cholesterol, plaque formation or platelet plug formation is inhibited. And if the disease has already set in, there is no much difference with the benefit with treatment, because already the nerve has gone into ischemia, there is no use treating it. Similarly, papilledema, this is the last topic for today. This is again an important one. It can be asked as a 4 marks or a 2 marks. So papilledema is nothing but it is a passive disc swelling associated with raised intracranial tension. So in optic neuritis, there was a disc swelling. So in optic neuritis, there is swelling of the disc, edema of the disc. But the cause was some infectious cause like measles, mumps, or idiopathic, I told you, or there could be trauma, or there could be different causes for optic neuritis. So there is an active inflammation there. It is an active process. Whereas in papilledema, it is a passive process. It is a passive disc swelling, secondary to raised intracranial tension. I told you the optic nerve is surrounded by the meningeal sheaths. There is dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater. So the meningeal sheaths, that is the subarachnoid space around the optic nerve, is in continuation with the subarachnoid space of the brain. So any raised intracranial tension, the raised intracranial pressure is also transmitted along the subarachnoid space through the cerebrospinal fluid into the optic nerve. So once the optic nerve is pressure is increased around the optic nerve, it gets compressed. Once it gets compressed, the axoplasm doesn't flow back into the optic nerve. It gets accumulated in the optic disc, and the optic disc gets swollen up. So it is a passive disc swelling. There is no active disc swelling. There is no inflammation, nothing. Passively, because of raised intracranial tension, the disc is swollen. Almost always bilateral, though asymmetric, because the raised intracranial tension, it transmits to both the optic nerves. It is not that it is only localized to one particular quadrant. So almost always it is bilateral only, but it could be asymmetric. That is, one disc may start earlier, the other disc may start later. So it is an asymmetric but bilateral passive swelling of the disc associated with raised intracranial tension, that is papilledema. So you have to remember this condition, passive. In PG entrance, they might be asking. So papilledema is an active disc swelling, passive disc swelling. What is which is true, which is false? So it's a passive disc swelling. Okay. So disc edema, all causes of active and passive swelling are called disc edema. So disc edema is a term we use for any kind of disc edema, whether swelling of the optic disc. It could be either active or passive due to inflammation or non-inflammatory. It could be due to optic neuritis or papilledema. We call it disc edema. But if it is passive, we always reserve the term papilledema for passive disc swelling. So passive optic disc swelling due to raised intracranial tension, only that is known as papilledema. Okay. So what are the causes of disc edema? This is disc edema, not papilledema. That is in general. Active cause like inflammation, papillitis, ocular hypotony only. Suppose the optic nerve is here and the eyeball is shrunken up. So when the eyeball shrinks, the pressure in the eyeball drops, the blood automatically flows from there to here. And because of gravity, the axoplasm also stays in the optic nerve. It doesn't go back to the intraorbital part, it stays here. So this is the stasis of the axoplasm, so which causes the leak here. So wound leak after cataract surgery. Similarly, vascular occlusions like CRVO, orbital causes like cellulitis or tumors, infiltrations like leukemia, lymphoma. So all these things cause disc edema. Okay. And papilledema causes, that is secondary to raised intracranial tension. What are the various causes of raised intracranial tension? This will be dealt in your neurosurgery part in general surgery. Intracranial space occupying lesion, ICS7. Congenital lesions like Arnold-Chiari malformation, Budd-Chiari syndrome. Arnold-Chiari malformations, not Budd-Chiari. Budd-Chiari is for liver. It is Arnold-Chiari malformation for the brain. So aqueductal synostosis or intracranial infections like meningitis, tumors of the spinal cord, idiopathic intracranial hypertension, also known as pseudotumor cerebrae, which is seen in young obese women. It presents with chronic headache and there is a sixth nerve palsy and the patient may have a squint. Sixth nerve is palsied, so eyeball goes inside, medial rotation. And systemic diseases like pregnancy-induced hypertension and blood dysplasias. These are the various causes for papilledema. All things you can by heart, just nothing concept here, everything just by hearting. So unilateral versus bilateral. And usually papilledema is bilateral. I told you in most of the cases it is bilateral because raised intracranial tension transmits to both the eyes equally. But it could be asymmetric. One eye may be earlier involved, other eye may be involved later, but it is usually bilateral. But there are conditions like Foster-Kennedy syndrome and pseudo-Foster-Kennedy syndrome, which are very important. So just pay a little attention. I know it is very difficult. After 3 classes at the end of time, it is difficult to concentrate. But just remember only 3 more slides. So what is this Foster-Kennedy syndrome is? Suppose there is an olfactory or a sphenoid meningioma. Suppose there is a meningioma as a tumor arising from the meningeal sheaths. So there is an olfactory or a sphenoid meningioma or a frontal lobe tumor. What it happens is it causes pressure on the optic nerve. Okay, on optic nerve or on the optic nerve. So what happens is due to that pressure, there is an optic atrophy in one side. So due to that tumor, there is an optic atrophy in one eye. And as the intracranial tension is raised, there is papilledema. So when there is an optic atrophy, papilledema doesn't manifest. So what is the basic mechanism of papilledema is the axoplasm remains in the neurons. So you know there are axons, ganglion cell layer of the retina continues in the optic nerve. So the axoplasm remains static in the neurons, that is the axons of the ganglion cell layer, and it doesn't drain into the optic nerve. That's why you get papilledema or swelling of the optic disc. So here there is stasis of the axoplasm. So when there is a frontal lobe tumor, it causes pressure on the optic nerve, leading to optic atrophy that side. So this atrophic nerve fibers, atrophic optic nerve doesn't get swollen up. So automatically what happens is one side goes into optic atrophy. The other side, there is edema of the disc due to raised ICT, papilledema, because of the tumor. So there's an olfactory lobe tumor, which causes raised ICT. But at the same time, what it does is this tumor, along with causing raised ICT, It also causes direct pressure over the optic nerve and causes atrophy of the optic nerve on one side, on which side the tumor has arisen. So an atrophied optic nerve head never goes into edema, papilledema. So one side there is optic atrophy, other side there is papilledema due to raised ICT. This is known as Foster-Kennedy syndrome. Then what is pseudo Foster-Kennedy syndrome? There is already an optic atrophy due to some other cause, due to some trauma, due to some AON, or due to some Leber's optic neuropathy or some other condition. There is already an optic atrophy in one eye. So there is raised ICT due to some other cause and it causes papilledema on the other healthy side. That is known as pseudo Foster-Kennedy syndrome. So what is Foster-Kennedy syndrome? Both eyes are initially normal, frontal lobe tumor, pressure on one side optic nerve goes into optic atrophy. Due to the tumor, there is raised ICT causes papilledema in the other eye. That is Foster-Kennedy. Pseudo Foster-Kennedy is already there is an optic atrophy due to some glaucoma, due to some Leber's disease or some other cause. So there is pre-existing optic atrophy. And the logic is the atrophied optic nerve never goes into edema. So this one will remain atrophied, and due to some tumor in the brain, maybe occipital lobe tumor or spinal cord tumor, there's a raised ICT which causes papilledema on the normal side. That is known as pseudo Foster-Kennedy syndrome. So pathogenesis of High-Res theory. There is a theory called High-Res theory. In that, suppose this is an axon of the optic nerve, there is a stasis of the axoplasm. So because increased retrobulbar pressure, suppose behind the eyeball in the retrobulbar space, there is some tumor which is pressing on the optic nerve. So the axoplasm is unable to pass. Suppose this is the optic nerve head, this is the intraorbital part. So the axoplasm usually flows freely. Suppose here there is some pressure over the optic nerve. This axoplasm doesn't go here. It remains stasis here. So leads to edema of the disc here. So increased retrobulbar pressure. Similarly, reduced intraocular pressure. Suppose the intraocular pressure is reduced and here the pressure of the axoplasm is more. So what happens? Due to gravity, this axoplasm comes here. So it settles in this optic disc and it causes edema. So this is called as High-Res theory, which is the pathogenesis for this one, or papilledema. So usually within how many days does this papilledema manifest? So raised ICT within 1 to 5 days. So suppose there is some head injury to the patient, there is a road traffic accident, the patient has got some intracranial bleed. So within 1 day to 5 days. So within 1 to 24 hours to 5 days, the papilledema can get manifested. It can be detected ophthalmoscopically. In case of subarachnoid hemorrhage, in 2 to 8 hours itself, the papilledema will be visible in the examination of the fundus. Okay, so it can be onset of papilledema after the onset of raised intracranial tension is as fast as it could be 2 to 8 hours, or sometimes it can take 1 to 5 days. Within 1 to 5 days, papilledema develops and recovery takes place between 6 to 8 weeks. Within 6 to 8 weeks, it recovers. So what are the clinical features of raised ICT? All general surgery things and general medicine things: headache, projectile vomiting, diplopia, focal neurological deficits, depending on the lesion involved, which lobe is involved, and diplopia because the oculomotor nerve or the nerves are compressed, thereby leading to paralysis of extraocular muscles and diplopia. And amaurosis fugax, recurrent attacks of transient blackouts of vision because there is pressure on the optic nerve, the visual impulses are not getting conducted. There will be recurrent attacks of transient blackouts of vision is known as amaurosis fugax. And visual acuity and pupil reactions are normal till late stage, that is optic atrophy sets in. So what are the various stages of papilledema? Early, established, chronic, and atrophic. These are the 4 stages. This is everything you have to just by heart. I think the battery is also low. Okay, so early stage or incipient stage. This is all by hearting, nothing specific. Visual acuity is normal, no symptoms. Pupil reactions are normal. Fundus just shows nasal margins of the optic disc are blurred first. So in PG entrance, they'll be asking which optic disc margins are blurred first. So nasal margins are blurred first, and mild hyperemia of the optic disc will be seen. That is one thing you will see here. So here you see the nasal margins of the disc are little blurred and mild hyperemic, red color of the disc. This is early stage. And then established or fully developed, here transient visual obscurations, visual acuity is normal, pupil reactions are normal. Mild elevation of disc will be there and obliteration of physiological cup, hyperemic disc and blurred margins all around. So there only nasal margin was blurred, but here you see all the margins are blurred. The rest of the features are same. Hyperemic disc, engorged and tortuous veins and elevated disc. Similarly, chronic stage. In this chronic stage, visual acuity may be reduced, but pupil are normal unless atrophy sets in. Obliteration of physiological cup, and here champagne cork appearance will be changed. Will be seen. Champagne cork appearance of optic disc and hemorrhages and cotton wool spots resolve. So here you see it will be just like a champagne cork. So the hemorrhages will be resolving by this time in chronic stage. And then atrophic stage, it takes nearly 6 to 9 months for chronic papilledema. Here visual acuity is reduced and pupil reactions also gone. So remember that only in atrophic stage pupil reactions go, and the rest of the stages pupil reactions are normal. Visual acuity is also reduced only in atrophic stage. In other stages visual acuity is almost normal. Here because of gliosis there is grayish white disc and pallor of the disc. Retinal arteries are narrowed. So here see the disc becomes very pale and grayish white in color, and it is an atrophy. This optic atrophy will deal in next class. So these are the stages. Early stage, edematous disc, hyperemic disc, only nasal margin blood. Edematous, hyperemic disc, hard exudates, cotton wool spots, engorgement of vessels, but all the margins are blurred here. Here vision is normal, pupil reaction is normal. Here transient visual obscurations, pupil is normal. Here this edema and all the edema and hemorrhages and exudates resolve, but champagne cork appearance of the disc and vessels are narrowed. Here pupil reactions are normal, visual acuity is impaired. Here completely pale disc or grayish disc depending on the glasses, vessels are narrowed, visual acuity is reduced, and pupil reactions are also gone. So these 4 stages you have to write in your exam if it is asked for a 4 marks question. So what is the differential diagnosis of pseudopapilledema? It is pseudopapilledema. It could be due to optic disc drusen. I told you in hypermetropia, it is in hypermetropia, small disc, it can mimic a papilledema, and persistent hilar tissue, Bergmeister's papilla, Mittendorf's dot, all these I told you in congenital optic disc anomalies. So management, nothing, just do a neuroimaging, either CT brain or MRI brain, detect the cause and treat the cause, nothing more than that. Okay, nothing on the ophthalmic part. So this is for today. Any doubts you have? I think I took 5 minutes extra, 4 minutes. Any doubts you have, you can message in your chat box, or else we'll call it a day. Any doubts? Next class will be our last class on neuro-ophthalmology. We'll be dealing about optic atrophy in the next class. And with that, neuro-ophthalmology will be finished. Any doubts you have? Suppose no doubts, we can call it a day here and close. Okay, then no doubts, we'll close it here. Any doubts here, you can ask in next class also. Next class will be your last one on neuro-ophthalmology. Okay, after that, they'll be going to take you lacrimal apparatus. Okay, thank you all. అయిపోయిందేమో లెక్క ప్రకారం